Hello and welcome to State Scoop's Priorities Podcast. I'm Colin Wood, State Scoop's Editor-in-Chief. I recently interviewed Quinn Anex-Ries, a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology, about legislation advancing in Idaho that would prohibit state agencies from procuring or even using AI models that might promote principles of diversity, equity, or inclusion. But before we get into that, here's what's happening this week. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz on Monday named John Eichten, the state's deputy IT commissioner, as the new statewide chief information officer, replacing Tarek Tomes, whose official final day with the state was Sunday. Texas has named Tony Sauerhoff, who's been Texas's interim chief information officer since January, as the new statewide CIO. Sauerhoff, who most recently served as the state's chief artificial intelligence and innovation officer, replaces Amanda Crawford, who was appointed in January as the state's insurance commissioner. And Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs last week unveiled a plan designed to save her state as much as $100 million over 3 years, but without cutting essential services. In previewing the plan during her State of the State address in January, she said, "We will not decimate important services that families and businesses rely on." There's a piece of legislation in Idaho that would prohibit state agencies from procuring or using AI models that might promote principles of diversity, equity, or inclusion. House Bill 687 has passed the House and is now up for consideration in the state Senate. I asked Quinn Anex-Ries, a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology, about the bill, starting with some of the definitions it would rely upon to function effectively.
I think the challenge, though, in this discussion is that a lot of the definitions we're going to be talking about are very slippery, that they can be really broad, they can be wielded in specific instances to target certain kinds of speech or certain kinds of viewpoints or certain kinds of tools. But there isn't necessarily an agreed upon definition of, in this instance, woke, or what constitutes unbiased. And so it can create really uncertain terrain with the actors that are then tasked with targeting certain things that are deemed to be woke, or with implementing requirements in response to getting rid of woke, quote unquote, woke AI models, which opens up both a lot of challenges around implementing things and a lot of vulnerabilities for these concepts or requirements to be weaponized against certain viewpoints more than others.
Right. And in this case, we're talking about Idaho House Bill 687, which has passed, and there's a companion piece of legislation in the state Senate. Can you summarize what's in that House bill and what we know about it?
Yeah, and this will kind of get at a little bit of like, how are they thinking about, what might be targeted as woke in this context? So, like you said, this advanced in the House of Representatives in Idaho on March 2nd. And if passed into law, the bill would require that all state agencies, and this is going to be really important for our conversation, so it's a requirement for all state agencies that they can only procure and use large language models that adhere to the principles of truth-seeking and ideological neutrality. And now, I think for a lot of people, this might sound pretty nice and neat on the surface, but actually implementing this kind of bill is a really complicated legal, technical, and practical matter. So this is where we get to like the matter of how people are thinking about what woke is. That in the bill text, in demanding ideological neutrality from procured models, the bill actually also calls out particular points of view, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, quote unquote, transgender ideology, quote unquote, intersectionality, as concepts that should generally be limited in AI systems. So this is really creating a fundamental tension here, where on the one hand, the bill is saying, this is about advancing ideological neutrality in systems while also calling out specific viewpoints as targets. I think we can kind of assume in the kind of construct of the bill that these viewpoints are being what are targeted as allegedly woke. And so I think really it comes down to like, what actually will this mean on the ground, which I think we should dig into in this conversation. But the other thing I just kind of want to add as I think important context here when it comes to Idaho's effort in particular, is that, Idaho's Office of Information Technology Services has published some guidelines and resources for state agencies on AI use. This bill would mark really the first major effort by state lawmakers to put guidelines or restrictions about how state agencies use AI. So I think we should all kind of ask, like, why is this actually the place to start from? And what will it mean for the state's efforts to modernize and adopt emerging technologies?
Right. Well, one thing that immediately occurred to me when looking at the bill text was that, to prioritize truth seeking and ideological neutrality are, I think, at least on their face, great goals.
Mhm.
Um, but it also sounds to me like the legislators maybe aren't fully appreciating the, these. I think these are things that the the people developing these models have been trying to do. They don't want,
Mhm.
this bill doesn't seem to be targeting hallucinations, but they don't want things that aren't true, and they seem to want things that are neutral. Even if this did pass, I don't see how this would be enforceable technologically.
Yeah, this gets at one of the core challenges with this kind of effort is that there are fundamental technical limitations here, both on defining neutrality and figuring out benchmarks by which you would evaluate these things. So on the first one, there's a contradiction in the bill's own definition. Defining neutrality as excluding certain viewpoints makes it inherently political and not neutral. And secondly, there's no single definition that exists for ideological neutrality. So neutrality could mean present both sides, default to the center, rotate perspectives, each with its own kind of flaws. Meaning, each of these could be a technical fix you could pursue, um, but that would each have its own limitations. So, presenting both sides could lend legitimacy to fringe views or those that don't align with clear social consensus. So if really, AI wanted to give a both sides of everything, many kinds of conversations could be pretty ridiculous. So you could think about, like, what would a both sides response be to what happened at the Apollo 11 moon landing? That could be something like the Apollo 11 moon landing was the first space flight to land humans on the moon and is widely regarded as a major feat in modern science. On the other hand, the entire thing could have been faked, right? Like, you would get kind of this ideological extreme if you wanted this kind of answer. And defaulting to, a centrist position, on the other hand, actually still privileges this particular stance. So you have a first-hand question of, like, technically finding a way to be neutral is actually an option you have to make and isn't straightforward.
Mhm.
The kind of second thing here is there is no consensus in the field about what type of benchmark you should be using to actually measure neutrality in a system, which in terms of implementation presents a practical problem to state agencies of you're being directed to do a compliance review of all vendors using different kinds of documentation, but you don't actually have a standard field-wide benchmark to measure that against. How are you going to make procurement decisions?
Mhm. Yeah, actually, that's really interesting because you just brought to mind a challenge that states are facing with accessibility right now, which should be as clear cut as accessibility, which has,
Mhm.
in terms of technology in the web, there are extensive standards and guidelines, but apparently even there, they're struggling to accurately score what vendors can do because it's very subjective in terms of a person needs to look at the technology and there's no standardized scoring system, evidently.
Mhm.
And even that is something that's much more concrete, it would seem, than something like a large language model where, the output, they're highly pliable. The output is depending on your prompt. Maybe you ask it like, this could, this could really stunts the capabilities of a system like this if you try to comply with such rules, because the whole idea of these systems, as far as I can tell, is that they sometimes too much try and make the user happy, try and give you the kind of output that you want, which is its own problem. But if you're telling it to give you a non-neutral answer, does it then just say like, oh, I'm not allowed to do that?
Mhm.
And as you said, what is a neutral answer? It's highly
Yeah, in
subjective.
this context, many states are already struggling to procure AI tools effectively. They don't have the right expertise in their procurement offices. They don't have the right expertise in their program offices to know how to evaluate claims made by vendors. So it's already a really challenging landscape, like what you're laying out in terms of accessibility. And so layering this pretty ill-defined requirement on top of all of that, at best will just worsen and confuse this procurement process where agencies are trying to keep up. And at worst, really injects opportunities for people to game the system, for corruption, for junk science to be now a fundamental part of a procurement process. The other thing that sticks out to me here is, the fiscal note for the bill actually indicates that they anticipate no additional cost for the implementation of this bill. I'm a little bit skeptical of that because, really for this to be implemented, agencies, like we were talking about, have to do these quote unquote compliance reviews where they're accessing technical documentation provided by vendors. You're either going to need your current personnel to spend a lot of time working on this, figuring this stuff out, or to bring on additional technical expertise to fully evaluate vendor disclosures. But either way, this is going to be a burden for agencies to implement, especially because it's pretty unclear what these requirements are and how you would actually assess this in a system in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Now, in articles that your organization has put out, has looked at similar federal efforts around this. Do you think that the Idaho bill is like a really honest effort to do this, or is this more just sometimes we see states doing things to try to align themselves with the White House? Could you summarize some of what we've seen from the federal government and how you think that relates to the Idaho bill?
Yeah, so this follows a very nearly identical effort at the federal level that started last year. So on July 23rd of 2025, President Trump signed an executive order titled Preventing Woke AI in the Federal Government. And really, that had many of the same objectives, where it essentially laid out that federal agencies could only procure AI models that similarly adhered to the principles of ideological neutrality and truth-seeking. And this executive order was followed by subsequent guidance from the Federal Office of Management and Budget that laid out requirements for federal agencies about essentially what this meant for their procurement process. And like Idaho's bill, basically outlines the different kinds of documentation federal agencies need to get from vendors to evaluate whether or not their tools are actually neutral. But that guidance is still really high level at the federal level and is leaving a lot up to individual federal agencies to figure out how to implement this stuff, which is concerning both for people that work on the technical aspects of AI for all of the reasons we were just talking about, and for folks that work on government procurement because of what it's going to mean for gumming up the works here. Idaho's bill hews really closely to this effort. And so, the worry is that many of those same challenges would port over to Idaho if they were to pass this into law. But that you're then talking about a much more resource-constrained environment of a state government that may not have the technical experts or procurement experts in-house to really figure out how to operationalize this in a coherent way. And so at both levels, you kind of risk losing opportunities for innovation within government because you just can't do the procurement, or scaring away vendors who feel like they can't adhere to these requirements, or opening yourself up to a lot of legal liability. Because think about what happens if you have a solicitation for a tool and a state, in Idaho's case, or a federal agency, selects a specific vendor, and they tell the vendors they didn't select it was because you didn't adhere to our unbiased requirement. It's a really broad, ill-defined requirement. Vendors are going to be incentivized to contest those award decisions in court. And if there's not a clear technical rubric that the decision was made on, this could be a really big risk for agencies to make decisions based off of this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole thing. My job, well, speaking of neutrality, my job is to be neutral, but I'm doing my best to give this the benefit of the doubt. But the whole thing seems like a large kind of opportunity cost. I think really efforts could be better spent on other things. But like kind of in parallel to this, a couple state AGs, including in Montana, have made other demands on LLMs. Could you explain what those have been?
Yeah, so this is the part where it kind of gets interesting about how this Idaho bill and the federal effort to target it government agency uses, because this has interesting implications for how we think about the sort of First Amendment impacts here. So like you said, we've seen over the last year attempts to target specific companies by state attorneys generals for the outputs of their tools. So we saw the Montana Attorney General send a letter to Google suggesting that they may be in violation of state law for Gemini outputs that, quote, hedged answers about Palestinian violence against Israelis and refused to answer about whether Hamas was a terrorist organization. And also last year, we saw the Missouri Attorney General send letters to Meta and others suggesting that it was a violation of state law for a chatbot to rank President Trump last in a response to a prompt about ranking the last few presidents in order from best to worst. You know, really what this is important to understand is this is happening in the backdrop of a lot of these efforts to target various AI companies based on specific viewpoints. Now, generally, courts have ruled that viewpoint-based content restrictions by government actors are unconstitutional. And so if, this state effort, for instance, had tried to outlaw broadly DEI-friendly models and outputs for everybody, courts would almost certainly invalidate that as some kind of restriction on First Amendment grounds. This does become a little bit different when we're talking about how they're creating limitations on vendors interacting with state agencies. Now, within a contract, a public agency can seek a variety of requirements from a vendor. The concern, though, then becomes, is this weaponized to shape other forms of speech outside of the government contract? Does this have downstream effects that impacts how other people using this tool who aren't government agencies can seek information? And that's what really has, troubling implications for access to information and speech for everybody.
So if this ends up passing in Idaho, and as you mentioned, the kind of outcome of the federal just the federal action on this has been like the consequences of that have been a bit fuzzy. Do you have a clear picture of what this would mean for Idaho and maybe as a precedent for other states?
That's really the open question, right? Like when you look at the bill, it's written so that it will go into effect immediately. There's no lead time given to state agencies to figure out how to implement things, to let the Office of Information Technology Services provide additional guidance or work with agencies. They basically flip on a switch and say, follow these requirements now. So given that accelerated timeline, given that they're not saying that they're going to appropriate any additional money for agencies to do this, what does that mean? Does that mean agencies will kind of shrug and say, I think what we're using is fine? Will, a really conservative, lowercase c conservative general counsel in an agency say, oh, this makes me afraid about any LLM we're using, stop all use indefinitely until we can do this kind of evaluation?
Sure.
So, it could really be doesn't do anything, or it could really make it so that agencies have an extremely hard time doing very basic procurements with LLMs and basic use across an agency if there's sort of an ongoing internal struggle over what it means. Or if vendors turn around and feel like they're being unfairly targeted under these new requirements, they could seek to sue a variety of state agencies because they're losing out on really valuable contracts. So if I worked in a state agency in Idaho, I would be really worried about what it could mean for just my use of LLMs in my daily practice and really slowing down the efficiency and effectiveness of state government. I think the only other thing I would add, to an earlier point you were bringing up is there are other efforts happening in states to think about how do you make sure that our government is being rigorous in how we evaluate the AI tools we buy, to make sure that they're accurate and performing well, and that they're not harming our constituents. So there are models out there for thinking about what kind of safeguards are you going to place, what kinds of evaluations you're going to require state agencies to do before procuring a tool. So there's other roads state governments can go down if they're genuinely concerned about the efficacy of tools. So it shouldn't be a zero-sum game where it's like either you're doing this kind of effort to target particular viewpoints in LLMs or doing nothing. I think there's a much more common sense middle ground that a variety of states across the political spectrum have chosen to go down that says, hey, let's make sure our Office of Technology has procurement guidance for state agencies and has standard contract language and has risk requirements that have to be put in place for high risk use cases. That could be an alternative to this kind of approach, and at the very least would make much more sense as a starting point than immediately jumping to something that's really ill-defined and going to be hard for state agencies to wrap their arms around.
That was Quinn Anex-Ries with the Center of Democracy and Technology. That's it for this episode. The Priorities Podcast is a production of Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. Production work is done by Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher. I'm Colin Wood. Thanks for listening.